Well, joining us now is Marieke Walsh, parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail, Joël-Denis Bellavance, Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse, and Joanna Smith, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. Hello to the three of you.
Hi.
So listen, let's quickly talk about this clean fuel regulation, this fuel levy, which Conservatives are describing as a second carbon tax. Here we have the PBO saying it's going to cost families on average about $1,000 more per year, and that it's going to hit low-income families even harder. A quick go-around here. How bad is this for the Trudeau government as Canadians continue to struggle with affordability? Marieke, I'll ask you to start.
Well, I think a bit right now is a communications challenge for the government. It is a price on carbon that is layered on other carbon taxes. The Environment Minister tried to dispute that this week by calling it a price on pollution. Well, that's a price on carbon. So it is something that the government, I think, has caught a bit flat-footed in the last few months on remembering that it now needs to make the case for these policies because Pierre Poilievre is the new opposition leader and he is opposed to these policies and has promised to axe them. And so they need to be able to make the case, and they're struggling to do so. And I'll note that despite the fact that the federal government was disputing the PBO's report, that's the Budget Watchdog's report on this, it actually very closely reflects what the government's own analysis from last year says about the exact same policies. So far, they're struggling, I think, to explain it.
Joël-Denis?
Yeah, I agree with Marieke. It's also a problem because the government says this is necessary to fight climate change. They're not making the link in a very convincing manner. And Pierre Poilievre has an advantage on this because if this price increase has an effect on inflation, he will be able to point out your policies is fueling inflation and is hurting ordinary Canadians. So we'll see in the next few months how it affects inflation. But usually when the price of gas goes up, it does affect inflation.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, even during the Liberal convention, some were admitting to me, the party has a communications issue. And so this will certainly fall into that. Joanna, what do you think of it?
I was talking to my colleague Mia Rabson, our energy reporter, about this, and she made a really good point. There's some schools of thought that you shouldn't be doing carbon pricing and clean fuel regulations at the same time, essentially pick a lane. But what has happened was Canada has come relatively late to the carbon pricing game. And if they want to be able to meet those emissions reductions target, they do need to bring in more than one stick. I think the other thing missing from the PBO analysis is the cost of climate change itself, right? And so the Conservatives are conveniently ignoring that, but I think the Liberals are ignoring the pricing pit and the affordability angle at their own peril too. They are having a communication challenge. We are not necessarily going to see the economic benefit of these investments in clean tech for maybe another 7 to 10 years, right? So what are they doing in the interim? I found it interesting that PBO himself has said he doesn't love how either party really is spinning these analyses. He says this is looking at one issue, you need to look at it in a macro way, and I think both of them are choosing their points selectively.
Yeah, they're both simplifying it, right? They're both trying to pick and choose which details and which facts form their narrative rather than giving the whole picture. The Liberals, for example, acknowledging that there is some cost, but saying the cost is worth it, and here's why. They haven't done that part of it.
Okay. Well, speaking of costs, we know that there's a big cost attached to the Stellantis EV battery plant right now, the work on hold there in Windsor, Ontario. We know Stellantis is looking for more money after the Volkswagen deal. But, Joël-Denis, given the perceived importance of this plant for future work in the Windsor area and really for the automobile industry in this country, does the Liberal government have any choice but to basically fold to the demands Stellantis is making?
I think they have no choice. They set the bar with the Volkswagen deal, and they wanted to keep it confidential for the longest time to prevent other companies to know what Volkswagen got out of the federal government. Now it's out in the open, and so other companies who may have plans to invest in Canada will be demanding the same thing. So the federal government, with putting its cards on the table, everybody can see what they have in store for other companies. And guess what? It's a race to get those companies to invest in Canada as opposed to the United States to make sure that we have the plants of the future that will build the cars of the future. So I think the options for the federal government are pretty limited. One advice that I can give them is do not fight publicly with the Ontario government, because that will only scare investors if you are fighting with other governments about how much money should be put on the table. So I think they'll have to swallow their pride and probably give way to what the Stellantis is demanding.
Yeah, let's pick up on that point, though, because the federal government, as we heard Chrystia Freeland just say, we want Ontario to step up and pay their fair share. But, from Ontario's point of view, they're giving Stellantis this exact same amount that they gave to VW, $500 million. What argument is there that would compel Ontario to give more to this, Joanna?
I think the fact that the shovels were already in the ground is, I think, a calculation the federal government was making, maybe on both the Stellantis and the Ontario side, that maybe their risk-benefit analysis is, well, no one's going to pull out of this now that we've actually started. Both Industry Minister Champagne and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland have made the point that these two projects, Volkswagen and Stellantis, are largely to the benefit of Ontario in terms of number and jobs and economic things happening there. I think they need to be mindful about how other provinces might feel about that, and that's something the Bloc Québécois has raised in the House of Commons. So I think at this point, like, the deal's already really kind of done. It's just a matter of who pays for what. And I can, you know, I think the feds initially, obviously, they thought this was all done and dusted before the Volkswagen thing came along and before the US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, came along. They now have to pivot. They now have to change. And I think they keep saying they don't want to negotiate in public. They are clearly negotiating in public in terms of making it clear they want Ontario to pay a little bit more.
But one thing is clear, if I may quickly, Ottawa cannot afford to lose that company because the signal would be very bad. And at a time when the industry minister is trying to attract more companies, if one of the nature and the stature of Stellantis leaves Canada, that's not good news.
Yeah, well, you know, but I do wonder, Marieke, and I'll ask you to come in at this point, what is being said about this precedent? Because it is a very expensive precedent that's been set when you look at the deal given to VW.
I think that's exactly it, and this goes way beyond Stellantis, right? For what the government now does for the next decade as it's competing with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. The government, when it announced the VW funding, kind of pegged it as a boutique one-off or sort of one of a few that might be coming down the road, not as the new standard. And what Stellantis is saying is actually the U.S. has set the standard, and if you want us to even consider you, you have to meet that standard. And so how that translates to the next 10 years of investments that the federal government wants to attract through its budget measures that it rolled out just a few months ago is very unclear in terms of the cost that the government's willing to accept for it.
Yeah, let alone the cost of even developing a critical minerals industry, because that's the other big part of this. Listen, we're quickly losing time here, but before we go, I also want to talk about, because we're now fast approaching the deadline for David Johnston to submit his report to the Prime Minister as to how we're supposed to move forward on foreign interference. But as we wait for that report to come out, we now know that Pierre Poilievre has decided not to speak with David Johnston. What do you make of that move? Principle, political theater, Marieke?
I think it's political strategy, right? He, from the start, has tried to discredit whatever comes from David Johnston, discredit the position he has, discredit his role. And so not meeting with him, refusing to do so, just feeds into that strategy and gives him a lot of leeway to say whatever he wants when the actual recommendations come out on Tuesday.
Okay.
I have a very strong view on this one. I think it's a bit shocking that Mr. Poilievre chose not to meet Mr. Johnston because of who he is and who he was in the past. He's the former Governor General. I think he likes and respects institutions. And just to point out that the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet, a separatist, chose to meet Mr. Johnston to discuss this. So if a separatist leader is interested in that, why not the future Prime Minister of Canada?
It's a good question. Joanna?
I think it's both theater and principle. I think from the start he made that decision that this was going to be something he wasn't going to give any credibility to. That started happening before we even knew who was chosen as a special rapporteur, right? And so I think it is only logically consistent for him to now refuse to meet him. Otherwise, he would be undermining his entire strategy from the start.
Okay. I have a surprise question for you at the end because I actually have a bit more time here. And I do want to ask because, as I said, this deadline is fast approaching. When I think about it, I find it hard to think that David Johnston can come to any other conclusion but to call for a public inquiry because the demands for it is coming from every corner. And it's not as if this issue has diminished since the report started coming out at the end of last year. Future cast here, Marieke, what do you think might happen come Tuesday?
I don't know what will happen come Tuesday, but I do think that if he doesn't recommend an inquiry, that's even more difficult for the Prime Minister's office because he has said he will do whatever David Johnston recommends. And so the pressure will only mount on him if he does not. I don't think it closes the door. It doesn't put a bow on this issue, which is what the Liberals want. They want to find a way to put this on the back burner rather than the front burner. And so there is a lot of risk in that, given how much the Prime Minister has tied himself to whatever Mr. Johnston says.
I think the fundamental question that Mr. Johnson is asking himself, what do we need to make sure that Canadians keep faith in their institution? And that question, I think, will be at the forefront of what his recommendation. And I agree with your assessment that he will recommend an independent public inquiry.
Yeah. And Joanna?
I agree with them both. I think an inquiry would be recommended, and I do also think that's what the Liberals secretly really want. Not only does it put things on the back burner, but it kind of gives some control to them in terms of perhaps having some sway over the terms of reference. There could be a way for Johnson to describe the inquirer, whoever ends up being, the commissioner, to write it in a way that it maybe is perhaps more focused on policy than on accountability. Those will be things that we'll be watching, right, in terms of how it's set up. But I think it kicks the can down the road a little bit and gives the Liberals a thing to point to.
Okay. Well, of course, we are watching. And for our discussion that we just had, Marieke, Joël-Denis, Joanna, thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.